This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 264 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today's episode is titled Celebrity Encounters on Your Travels, and you might think that celebrity encounters isn't something that really fits with a thoughtful travel podcast, but as we reach the end of another kind of rather tricky and difficult year, I suppose, during these pandemic times, I decided it was time for something a bit lighthearted, and I've been collecting these stories for a while and absolutely love them. They're all about meeting famous people while we're traveling. But, the funny thing is, maybe it's not that surprising given, my listeners are fairly like-minded in this way, that all of the stories are not kind of like starstruck, oh, I met this famous person and I rushed up to them and blah, blah, blah kind of stories. Not at all. But anyway, I won't tell you more. I'll let the stories, and the guests speak for themselves in a minute. But first of all, I must tell you about my own celebrity encounter. I probably should preface it by saying that I'm not really a good pop culture kind of person. I guess I'm more likely to recognise some obscure non-fiction author than a current movie star. I'm really bad at that kind of stuff. But that maybe explains why my famous person sighting dates all the way back to 1985. So yes, I was 9 years old. It was on our big 6-month camp vanning trip around Europe. And it's important to note that I had grown up on a really steady diet of British comedy. That was both a lot of what was on Australian TV back then and especially what my family liked and watched together. So one of our favourites was an old comedy called Are You Being Served? It was about the employees of a department store. If you haven't seen it, there are plenty of episodes on YouTube. I already went down a rabbit hole watching some of them today, and it was quite a nostalgic trip down memory lane. Anyway, so the point is, this celebrity might be very meaningless to many of you, but I still remember exactly the situation like it happened yesterday. We were in a bank in Venice in Italy. Back in those days, we were travelling with traveller's checks, and so every so often we would have to spend some time in a bank trying to get them converted into cash. It was always a hassle. But we were in this bank in Venice, and we saw the actor who played Mrs. Slocum in Are You Being Served? Molly Sutton. And the whole family recognised her immediately. I remember she was like on the other side of the bank. We didn't speak to her or anything, but we were all like, oh my goodness, it's Mrs. Slocum. And, for us, I think, especially because, I'd grown up in Perth, and back then especially we never saw anybody famous. Anybody who was anybody did not live in Perth. And the idea of seeing someone we knew from TV was like this massive thrill. You got to remember, this is like, at least a decade before the internet became something we'd even heard of. So actually the funny part to this story is I actually phoned both my mum and my dad today to fact check this memory because I was only 9 years old and I thought, I'll just check. And so I rang my mum first because she actually has a typed copy of the travel diary she kept on that trip. And she's usually pretty reliable for fact-checking incidents from 1985. But I asked her what she remembered and she was like, oh, no, that couldn't have been in Venice. We didn't stay in Venice long enough to go to a bank. But she also couldn't think where it would be. And then she read through her diary and couldn't confirm or deny any of it. So, okay, well, we'll see. So I phoned my dad. And I just sort of gave vague, do you remember that we saw someone famous? And he immediately said, oh, yes, in a bank in Venice. I was like, yes, I was right. And then we did agree that it was definitely Mrs. Slocum from Are You Being Served? And so I figure both of us can't be wrong, and it must have happened as it did. But it's a good reminder you should note all those cool and important things that happen to you in a travel journal. You might think you'll remember, but you don't always. So anyway, that's my I really don't think I've had any other celebrity encounters on my travels. I probably have. I just didn't know they were celebrities. So that's me. But on to my guests, and my first one is from a dear friend, Jennifer Johnston. Now, Jen first told this story on a Travel Writers Zoom Drinks call last year, and of course, when I was thinking about making an episode about celebrity encounters, I had to get Jen to retell it for the podcast.
So when I was in America as an exchange student at the University of Massachusetts, I'd take trips whenever I had the opportunity, like Easter break and things like that. And I think this was Easter, and I have a friend that I went to high school with, and her parents lived in Nashville, Tennessee. So I had prearranged to go down and meet up with them. And her father and mother are Australian, but he was a leading heart surgeon in Nashville and had been there for 20 years or something. So she'd grown up in Nashville, but she'd come back to Australia to go to high school because there was a connection at the high school. I think her mother went to the same school. Anyway, so I was with her family and they said, we're just going to a friend's place for lunch. And I said, okay, and who's that? And she said, Johnny Cash. And no, this is a really terrible thing to say, but I've never, up until that point, really been a country music fan. I like country music now. So I actually didn't have any idea really who Johnny Cash was. So off we go in the car. We turn up for lunch and, we're met by this very tall, quite imposing figure at the door, welcomes us in. And we sit down and we meet his wife as well, June Carter Cash. And we sit down, I can't even describe the house, and I don't have any photos of it, which is the most annoying.
Sacrilege.
I know. It's just pure memories. But it was the house by the lake that one of the Bee Gee brothers bought.
Oh, okay.
Many years after, So I kind of followed a bit of the history of the house. And then whichever Bee Gee brother owned it, it caught on fire. And, was destroyed. So it actually doesn't even exist now.
Right.
But anyway, so back to lunch. So we're sitting there and I'm all of 20 and I'm just like, a beautiful grand table. So my friend's parents and all their kids are there and my friend. And they've actually got, I don't know whether you call it a maid, who was, serving us lunch. And I remember that, the table being very fancy, and all the plates and stuff, really beautiful. And I'm thinking, I better be on my best behaviour here. Anyway, there's this pot in the middle and June stood up and said, I'm going to serve you my famous pea soup. And I was just sitting there going, oh, no, because I cannot stand peas. I absolutely hate peas.
Oh, no.
But I knew that, to not have it would be
very impolite.
Insulting. So, she served them up and I just remember the bowl of green soup just sitting in front of me and I thought, you know what, the best I can do is probably just take a few sips, and just consume a little bit of it so that it's considered polite.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so I did that, got through lunch. I can't even remember what the next course was, but I just remember the pea soup because I'm just like,
oh, no, of all the things, yeah.
But anyway, my Johnny Cash is just such a hospitable host.
Nice.
He wanted us to go and have a look at, because I think he's part Cherokee or part Indian, or maybe he had an interest in Indian history, but he took us to this room where he had these beautiful big books filled with parchment paper, and they were all filled with original sketches of all these Indian chiefs.
Oh, wow.
And Indian women. I remember that distinctly. It was cool. Just, and he was showing us, Peace Boat. And I was just like, oh, this is interesting. But I still didn't click who Johnny Cash was. So terrible.
And your friend didn't say to you, hey, this guy's really famous or anything, as you're on the way or anything?
No, because I think for her, so the connection, he had a heart issue and her dad had operated on him.
Right, okay.
So that's how they became friends.
Mm-hmm.
So
it was just normal to her that they knew him. So it wasn't,
yeah.
Oh, wow.
But it was just a very interesting lunch, very interesting day. He ended up like showing us one of the latest movies that he was in, and I'm just like going, okay, I really actually wanted to get out of there because I just was not, wow. Like, you know, if I could rewind now and go back with my knowledge of who he was and who he became, I would have been taking it in a lot more and possibly maybe taking a photo on my silly little camera, which would have been the real, you know, the film, the canisters.
Yes, exactly.
But anyway, so
oh,
it was
goodness. So when did you
such a lovely
realise
day.
how famous he was? Like only much later, or?
Oh, it was probably when I was like late 20s, and I think I repeated that story.
Yeah.
And people were like, Johnny Cash. My dad loves Johnny Cash. We grew up listening to Johnny Cash. And so, and then I don't know when the movie came out, Walk the Line.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not really
back,
good, but
yeah.
But I watched that and I just went, no way. That's who he was. That's who she was, because June Carter Cash was famous in her own right.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, Jen. So my friend who's, you know, was the daughter, she just tells this story and said, you were not interested. You were so not interested. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I mean, I knew I was at a beautiful house and they were special people, but I just didn't realise the enormity.
I just love Jen's story. Now, funnily enough, not recognising that you're in the presence of, you know, quite a famous celebrity is an ongoing theme for this episode. And the same thing happened to my next guest, Vicky Sahami.
This was in 1995, I think, again. Was that true? No, 1985, 85. Sorry. Still very vibrant. Anyway, I was about 20 at this time, and my parents had left the country, so I didn't have any place to spend my holidays. And I was in school, and I had a friend from high school who was in an interesting family. She was fairly wealthy, and they would often vacation at these different places. So the mom had this thing where she would just rent someplace cool, whether it was, you know, in Africa or in Europe or the Caribbean or whatever. And she would just tell her kids where it was, send them tickets, and they would all go there and they would have a fabulous Christmas holiday.
Wow.
Right.
That's not what my Christmas is like.
No, my parents moved to China and basically said, have at it, kid. Good. You know, it was nice to see you. We'll see you in a year. You know, no concern about the holidays. So anyway, I was in my dorm room when I got a call from her, and she said, well, I know you don't have anywhere to go for Christmas. Why don't you join my family? We're going to be in Antiga, which is an island in the Caribbean. And I'd never heard of it. I had to look it up on a map, find my ticket, get there. But it was fabulous. It was lovely. And in 1985, and I'm not entirely sure about this, but I think, you know how there are places where the rich and famous go, and then after about 5 to 10 years, the regular people hear about it, and then we start going, you know? So this was kind of in the transition period where Antigua was that place. And then I think normal people started to show up. So we were kind of in the transition zone. So some wealthy people and famous people were still finding it, you know, suitable. So anyway, we were just horsing around on the beach, and they have those platforms out in the water, and we had swam out to the platform, and there was myself and my friend Polly and this other person who we had met that day, and we were just hanging around with. And then this older gentleman swam up to the platform, and he introduced himself as Jack, and he says, "Do you mind if I share the platform with you for a little while?" And we're like, sure. And so he did. And I looked at him at one point, and I said, you know, you look familiar to me. Have we met? And he says, no, I don't think we've met, but you may have seen me on TV. Which in 1985 for me was, you know, I was the most likely of the three people to have seen somebody on TV, because I had actually grown up with a television, but my friend Polly had not.
Oh, wow.
This guy from the Fashion Institute of Technology who had come over from Europe probably was unfamiliar with American television. Mm-hmm. So I was it. And I didn't know who he was. So I was like, okay, whatever. So we threw the ball around and splashed in and out of the water, and, you know, just hung out for 30 minutes, probably. Told stupid jokes. I remember the joke he told us, actually. And then And then after about 30 minutes, these three just drop dead gorgeous women on the beach stood up and waved at him and called out and said, Jack, it's time to go. We have to go to the airport. And so he said, okay, well, I got to go. And he dove off and swam back to shore. And that was it. So it was sort of bugging me that this about this guy, because I had a feeling that, there was something there. And I got on the airplane to go home the next day, and I opened up the in-flight magazine, and there's this 2-page spread for the current movie that he was in, which was Pritzi's Honor. I don't know if you know that one.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I saw it in the theaters, but it had been in, several months earlier that I'd seen it in the theaters. And I was not a horror fan, so I had not seen The Shining. I had not seen any of these other ones that was famous for. But I had seen Pritzi's Honor, which was why he looked familiar. But anyway, so I opened up the in-flight magazine and I was sitting next to Polly. I said, Polly, this is him. Look, I told you. And that was Jack Nicholson. It was embarrassing that I didn't recognize him, because that was sort of silly.
Well, I mean, it's probably, I don't know, it depends, I suppose. It's probably nicer for someone famous, especially, kind of that famous, to just hang around with people who are not treating him as though he's super famous. So perhaps he didn't mind.
He seemed to enjoy it. If he wanted us to know who he was, he could have certainly dropped his last name.
He could have swum back to shore sooner if he didn't like hanging out with you. So he must have been happy. That's so funny, though.
Well, none of us looked quite as nice as his girlfriends. I got to tell you that. We were just.
Why were there so many girls? I guess maybe that's what happened.
I don't know, and I don't know I don't know who he's married to or who he was married to or whether he was. I don't know what the story was. But there was one young one and one older one and one. I don't know.
We'll have to do some research. Oh, that's hilarious. So with the benefit of hindsight, I feel like I would have recognised Jack Nicholson. I think he looks pretty distinctive, but perhaps I wouldn't have, especially kind of, out in the sea in a summer holiday. So I love this story as well. And maybe I would have done the same. Now, my final guest today is Bev Malzard, who had a different kind of celebrity encounter when she was on a media trip to Kota Baru in the Kelantan state of Malaysia.
When we were up there, we stayed at a hotel, and the 2 PR boys in the hotel took us to dinner that night for shark's fin soup, and I'm, not fond of bits of animals that they need to drive themselves.
Yeah.
And so we sort of did that, and afterwards they said, "Would you like to go to a nightclub?" And I mean, it's a Muslim state, and it's very not so much then, but, very conservative. So we go to a nightclub, pretty daggy, but full of people, and there was a band playing who were, a bit ordinary. But it was a night out and having a drink and everything. And, we look around and the door opens. Now, this is about 25 years ago. The door opens and this tall man walks in with very glamorous, as in really glamorous women around him, and an entourage that looked like, bodyguards or henchmen. And he was waving a gun around in the air. And I said to the guys, I said, "Who's that?" And they said, "Oh, that's the king." I said, "Oh, okay." Because in Malaysia, I don't know if it still works, but each sovereign state has a king. Uh-huh. And a king has different kings, different states every year or whatever. Anyway, I don't think it was his turn that year, but, he was the king. And when he came in, everyone's so obsequious. "Oh, the king," clapping him. I'm thinking, Jesus, he's got a gun. And but they all thought he was terrific. Then he goes up on the stage, still waving his gun, and took over the microphone and sang with the band. And the band are going, "Oh, it's the king," like it's Elvis or something. He sang really, really badly. And everyone's going, "Oh, bravo, bravo." Like he could sing. I thought, God, this guy's weird. And afterwards, the girlfriend I was with, she was very kind of tall, blonde, very pretty. And he came over to the table and he sort of grabbed her hand and kissed her hand and said, "Oh, you must come back to my place. We're having a party tonight." And she went, "Oh." And I'm kicking her under the table, so "Do not go to the king's place. Do not go with the king." So we got
He
that.
has a
the
gun.
Guys, he has a gun and he's got a palace and, you know.
You might never come out.
So we skedaddled out of there, but that was quite kind of funny thinking, you know, it could have been his one of his wives.
Yes, who knows what that could have led to, but I believe you made the right choice, but
yeah, that was a funny place.
So I am pretty sure that deciding to not go home to the palace with a king with a gun is a sensible life choice, but I do, I can't help wondering, it would have been very intriguing to see what happened, but perhaps it was the safest choice. So, thank you so much for listening to episode 264 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Who'd have thought I'd do a celebrity encounters episode, but I hope you've enjoyed it. I had so much fun putting this episode together and have been down all kinds of rabbit holes and had a good giggle at my guests' stories for a second or third time, because of course I've already, heard them as we recorded them. But yes, lots and lots of fun. So thank you so much to my guests. I started off chatting with Jennifer Johnston, and you can read more of Jen's work at her blog Travel Bug Within at travelbugwithin.com.au. I next chatted with Vicky Sahami. Now, Vicky actually has an interesting side business running solar eclipse tours. In fact, she's coming to Western Australia for to take a group to see the solar eclipse in 2023 up in the north of WA. You can find out more about her trips at siriustravel.com, that's SIRIUS. And finally, I chatted with Bev Malzard, and you can find more of Bev's writing at Travel Gal on the Move at travelgaltravels.com. Don't forget, you can join our groups and have a chat with like-minded travellers there. On Facebook, we are the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook and it's easy to find us. And for LinkedIn, if you go to notaballerina.com/LinkedIn, it will redirect you to the Thoughtful Travellers group in LinkedIn as well. And all of these links and more are in the show notes. And for this episode, the show notes are at notaballerina.com/264. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and as always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.